I've covered Tarkovsky before, doing a deep dive into everything I could find about him. Now, it's time to go further and enshroud ourselves in Eastern cinema and art. As I've done before, I will be combining resources of what I find online, various accounts, reactions, general audience reception. I will gather information about the film, the crew, Tarkovsky, as well as common interpretations and present it to you. This is done in order for us to form our own opinions, learn more, because you can never learn too much, and maybe, for those that fell asleep during viewings, attempt to regain favor. Along the way, I will sprinkle in my own collections, that is, my own thoughts, conclusions, speculations, musings, that sort of thing, but we will have a main idea to go for. This is about Tarkovsky's Stalker, and there are some notable things I'd like to mention before I begin. Tarkovsky plays with color in his films, and Stalker is no different. Before they get to the zone, everything is in black and white, sepia. Once they arrive, it is officially in color. He does everything for a reason, no matter what it may be. The Strugatsky brothers worked on the screenplay for Stalker, and as such, it actually features a meat grinder later on. Stalker and Roadside Picnic were a lot more involved together than I originally thought. Stalker was the final film Tarkovsky made in the Soviet Union. I transcended languages and began to search about this film in Russian. The Russian Wikipedia has a good deal more information than the English one, but the majority for us in the beginning will be the English one, and then we'll tackle everything else later on. Stalker is a 1979 Soviet science fiction film directed by Andrei Tarkovsky with a screenplay written by Arkady and Boris Strugatsky, loosely based on their 1972 novel, Roadside Picnic. In 1973, while still working on The Mirror, Andrei Tarkovsky wrote in his diary that he was interested in the Strugatsky brothers' new story, Roadside Picnic. In 1974, he contacted the writers and said that he would like to film it. At that time, Tarkovsky was also hatching plans to film Dostoevsky, The Idiot, and Tolstoy, The Death of Ivan Ilyich, and had taken on writing a screenplay based on the novel Ariel. However, by the end of 1975, he had finally decided that he would work with the Strugatskys on a screenplay based on their story. In February 1976, Tarkovsky officially received the go-ahead for filming from the chairman of the USSR State Cinema Committee, Philip Yermash. At the same time, the writers completed the second version of the script with the working title, The Desire Machine, which did not satisfy the director. Tarkovsky called those first drafts too motley and in need of boring. Please note, this Wikipedia is automatically translated to English from Google Translate, so you might have to fill in some blanks yourself. The writers were patient with the endless reworking of the future script. "We are fortunate to work with a genius," we said to each other then. "This means we must apply all of our strength and abilities to create a script that would satisfy our genius as completely as possible," said by Boris Strugatsky. Although Tarkovsky was not credited as a screenwriter, he was considered one of 3 co-authors, and his role was mainly to discard material. Boris Strugatsky recalled that, compared to the script for The Desire Machine, no other work had taken up so much of their energy, and called the work endlessly exhausting. Because of Stalker, the story Beetle in the Anthill was postponed. Philip Yermash warned Tarkovsky before the final approval that the brothers had a reputation for being unfilmable, especially after the failure of a previous attempt at a film adaptation based on The Guy from the Underworld. However, Tarkovsky stood firm. The film's launch could have been delayed even longer, and Tarkovsky had to write a letter to the 25th Congress of the CPSU, a fairly common practice at the time. In October 1976, the actors for the main roles were selected, and the location was found. The film crew included those who had more than one film with Tarkovsky under their belt: Georgy Roberg, Edward Artemiev, Ludmila Faganova, Nikolai Grinko, and Anatoly Solonitsyn. Now, I switched gears. The Russian Wikipedia mentions an earthquake, which is the entire reason for them having to change locations to Estonia. The production of the film was accompanied by many problems, in particular due to the earthquake of January 11, 1977 in the Isfara region. It was necessary to search for a new location, which took about 3 months. After a long search, Georgi Rublev found a new location in Estonia in April 1977, near the main post office in Tallinn, as well as 25 kilometers from the city, in the area of the old destroyed power plant on the Yagala River. Filming was completed on December 19, 1978. The film's budget was overspent by 300,000 rubles and exceeded 1 million. On February 15, 1977, the first studio scene of the film was shot, Stalker's house, in the opening episodes. Location shooting resumed in May in Estonia. The first developed materials turned out to be defective, and the director, having suspended production, went to Moscow for 40 days in order to sort things out. By July, filming resumed, and in August, a rough version of the film was ready where, according to the Strugatsky's, Tarkovsky played the tough guy and swindler Alan, close in spirit to the hero of Roadside Picnic, Red Shoehart. Due to constant reworking, the film began to go over budget. The script was rewritten right during the filming, which was slow and difficult. Tarkovsky was not at all satisfied with the results. He complained to Boris that everything was wrong and not right. The director's pickiness exhausted the crew. The film's artists worked on a scene that lasted several seconds on the screen for several days. Tarkovsky made sure that the lawn that would appear in the frame was only green. All the grass of the wrong shade was meticulously removed, one blade at a time. The film was shot on Kodak film, which was in short supply during the Soviet era, and it was only available to select directors. Georgi Rublev had worked with Kodak film before, and he had a reputation as one of the most professional Soviet cameramen. On August 9, 1977, several thousand meters of footage were irreparably damaged during film development in the Mosfilm studio laboratories. There were a variety of versions of this, from the film being replaced by ill wishers to a tactical move by Tarkovsky, who wanted to completely remake a film that did not suit him. The story received widespread publicity, and journalists even conducted investigations into it. However, according to writer Antas Skelandis, the cause was the usual negligence of the staff. The matter ended in a serious disagreement between Tarkovsky and Rublev. According to the memoirs of Pavel Fedotchinov, the intermediary between them was Masha Chuganova, Tarkovsky's beloved and devoted assistant. Andrei Artemiev said, "Masha, tell the cameraman that this and that needs to be done." Masha was silent, and Rublev, as if addressing her, said, "Masha, tell the director that I will not do this." As a result, the cameraman was removed from work on the film, although a small amount of material shot by him still made it into the film. After the film's difficulties, the crew assumed that it would be over, but in July 1977, Tarkovsky was able to obtain permission from the USSR State Committee for Cinematography, henceforth known as Goskino, to increase the budget to a 2-part film. According to Alla Latina, Philip Yermash was sympathetic to Tarkovsky, and this is the only way to explain the unexpected permission to increase the film's budget. In September to October 1977, filming continued with a new cameraman, Leonid Kalashnikov, and production designer Shavkat Abdussamov, who replaced Alexander Boym. However, Tarkovsky rejected all this material. Winter had begun, and such nature did not fit into the film's script. In October 1977, the script, which still did not satisfy Tarkovsky, was rewritten for the 8th or 9th time. The trial and error method, when the director could not explain to the scriptwriters what he wanted, eventually yielded results. As Boris Strugatsky recalled, he and his brother reached despair and finally came up with the Stalker Holy Fool. Tarkovsky liked this version, but winter suspended filming. In April 1978, he suffered a heart attack and began work again with the third team. The concept changed. The science fiction element completely disappeared, and Katanovsky brought a new image to life on the screen. In the third version, the cameraman was Alexander Knyazinski. In the end, on the third attempt, the film was completely reshot from June to December 1978. The film tells the story of an expedition led by a figure known as the Stalker, played by Katanovsky, who guides his 2 clients, a melancholic writer, Anatoly Solzhenitsyn, and a professor, Nikolai Grinko, through a hazardous wasteland to a mysterious restricted site known solely as the Zone, where there supposedly exists a room which grants a person's innermost wish. The film combines elements of science fiction and fantasy with dramatic, philosophical, and psychological themes. The film was initially filmed over a year on film stock that was later discovered to be unusable and had to be almost entirely reshot with new cinematographer Kinyazinski. Stalker was released by Goskino in May 1979. Upon release, the film garnered mixed reviews, but in subsequent years it has been recognized as one of the greatest films of all time, with the British Film Institute ranking it number 29 on its 2012 list of the 100 greatest films of all time. The film sold over 4 million tickets, mostly in the Soviet Union, against a budget of 1 million rubles. A man works in an unknown location as a stalker, leading people through the zone, an area in which the normal laws of physics do not apply, and remnants of seemingly extraterrestrial activity lie undisturbed among its ruins. The area containing the zone is shrouded in secrecy, sealed off by the government, and surrounded by ominous supernatural hazards. At home with his wife and daughter, the stalker's wife begs him not to go into the zone, lest he risk another long prison sentence, but he dismissively rejects her pleas. In a rundown bar cafe, the stalker meets his next clients for a trip into the zone, a writer and a professor. They evade the military blockade that guards the zone by following a train inside the gate and ride into the heart of the zone on a railway work car. The stalker tells his clients they must do exactly as he says to survive the dangers which lie ahead, and explains that the zone must be respected, and the straightest path is not always the shortest path. The stalker tests for various traps by throwing metal nuts tied to strips of cloth ahead of them. He refers to a previous stalker named Porcupine, who entered the room and left, became very rich, and then hanged himself. The writer is skeptical of any real danger, but the professor generally follows the stalker's advice. As they travel, the three men discuss their reasons for wanting to visit the room. The writer expresses his fear of losing his inspiration. The professor seems less anxious, although he insists on carrying along a small backpack. The professor admits he hopes to win a Nobel Prize for scientific analysis of the zone. The stalker insists he has no motive beyond the altruistic aim of aiding the desperate to their desires. After traveling through the tunnels, the three finally reach their destination, a decayed and decrepit industrial building. The men hesitate as the room is guarded by a meat grinder anomaly, which requires a death for someone to enter the room proper, causing an argument. In a small antechamber, a phone rings. The surprised professor decides to use the phone to telephone his former boss, to taunt him over finding the room. As the trio prepare to enter the room, the professor reveals his true intentions in undertaking the journey. He's brought a 20 kiloton bomb to destroy the room and prevent evil men from abusing it for their own gain. Blaming the room, Stalker and Stalker's clients for the rise of crime, social strife, military coups, and destructive science. The three men enter a physical and verbal standoff just outside the room that leaves them exhausted. The writer realizes Porcupine sent his brother to his death in the meat grinder and entered the room to wish for his brother back. But the room instead fulfilled Porcupine's secret desire for wealth, rather than bring back his brother from death. This prompted the guilt-ridden Porcupine to commit suicide. The writer tells them that no one in the whole world is able to know their true desires. And as such, it is impossible to use the room for selfish reasons. The professor gives up on his plan of destroying the room. Instead, he disassembles his bomb and scatters its pieces. No one attempts to enter the room. The stalker, writer, and professor are met back at the bar cafe by the stalker's wife and daughter. After returning home, Matrishka, or Monkey, the couple's deformed daughter, sits alone in the kitchen, reading as a love poem by Fyodor Tuchev is recited. She appears to use psychokinesis to push 3 drinking glasses across the table, one falling off, although this is made ambiguous as simultaneously a train passes by where the stalker's family lives and the entire apartment shakes. This scene is regarded as the three's journey throughout the zone. The one that falls is most likely Stalker, as this is what he does. He understands the zone, what it stands for, what it is. Keep in mind, this is my personal interpretation. The other two are professor and writer. Their deep philosophical arguments and conversations during their voyage into the zone reflect this. The meaning of the word stalker was derived by its use with the Strugatsky brothers and their novel Roadside Picnic, upon which the movie is based. In Roadside Picnic, stalker was a common nickname for men engaged in the illegal enterprise of prospecting for and smuggling alien artifacts out of the zone. According to Boris, prospectors and trappers were potential word choices before Stalker was decided on, which was at least partially inspired by Rudyard Kipling's character Stalky in his Stalky & Co. stories, of which both authors were fans. Their adaptation of the English word into Russian is pronounced slightly differently as Stalker, and it came into common usage after being coined by the authors. Tarkovsky also wrote stalkers from the word to stalk, to creep, in a 1976 diary entry. In the film, a stalker is a professional guide to the zone, someone having the ability and desire to cross the border into a dangerous and forbidden place with a specific goal. In a review in Slant magazine, critic Nick Shager described the film as a dense, complex, often contradictory, and endlessly pliable allegory about human consciousness, the necessity for faith in an increasingly secular, rational world, and the ugly, unpleasant dreams and desires that reside in the hearts of men, while conceding that the obliqueness of the imagery renders definitive interpretation both pointless and somewhat futile. Several critics have identified the nature of human desire as a central theme of the film. James Berardinelli interprets the film as suggesting that one's innermost desire may not be what one thinks it is, and that one may be better off not achieving it. While Shager describes the film as capturing the essence of what man is made of, a yearning for something that's simultaneously beyond our reach, and yet intrinsic to every one of us. Geoff Dyer argues that Stalker is seeking asylum from the world, and says that while the film may not be about the Gulag, it is haunted by memories of the camps. From the overlap of vocabulary, Zona, the meat grinder, to the Stalker's Zek-style haircut. Writer Lilya Kaganovsky says the film's mysterious zone draws comparisons with the Chernobyl exclusion zone that was established in 1986, 7 years after the release, in the aftermath of the Chernobyl disaster, and some of the people employed to take care of the Chernobyl power plant refer to themselves as stalkers. Though the film does not specify the origin of the zone, near the end, in a shot of the stalker with his family outside the zone, what appears to be a power plant is visible in the background. The themes of nuclear radiation and environmental degradation would be revisited by Tarkovsky in his final film, The Sacrifice. Midway in the film, the Stalker has an interior monologue in which he quotes the entire section 76 of Lao Tse's Tao Te Ching, the text of which characterizes softness and pliancy as qualities of a newborn, hence, new life. Hardness and strength, on the contrary, are qualities nearing death. Man, when he enters life, is soft and weak. When he dies, he is hard and strong. Slavistic Nils Ake Nilsson says that, in the context of the late Soviet stagnation, Tarkovsky makes a contrast between the oppressive dystopia of the outside world, marked by industrial decay, pollution, alienation, and political repression, and the zone, a realm of beauty and mystery. In conjunction with the room, they act as a representation of new possibilities, a utopia amidst the anti-utopian world of modern society, offering an escape from the constraints of the decaying society. The film reflects the disillusionment of late socialism, which fell short of the communist utopia, resulting in a stagnant and sterile reality. In this film, Tarkovsky wishes to emphasize two essentially human aspects, faith and love. He believes that faith cannot be dissolved or broken down. It forms like a crystal in the soul of each of us and constitutes its great worth. And that, when humans feel there is no more hope in the world, love is what proves them otherwise. The writer feels as though the world has become mundane and ordinary, and has become cynical of it. He desires to be shaken by the unknown, that is, the zone. What ends up surprising him is not the zone, but instead, the stalker's wife and her faithfulness to the stalker even after all he's put her through. Her love and her devotion are that final miracle which can be set against the unbelief, cynicism, moral vacuum poisoning the modern world, of which both the writer and the scientist are victims. In Tarkovsky's films, he believes that it is his responsibility to make his viewers aware and reflect on their need to love and to give their love. Like Tarkovsky's other films, Stalker relies on long takes with slow, subtle camera movement, rejecting the use of rapid montage. The film contains 142 shots in 163 minutes, with an average shot length of more than 1 minute, and many shots lasting for more than 4. Almost all of the scenes not shot in the zone are in sepia or a similar high-contrast brown monochrome, with the exceptions of scenes featuring his daughter, shot in color. After reading the novel Roadside Picnic by Arkady and Boris Strugatsky, Tarkovsky initially recommended it to a friend, the film director Mikhail Kalatozov. Thinking Kalatozov might be interested in adapting it into a film, Kalatozov abandoned the project when he could not obtain the rights to the novel. Tarkovsky then became very interested in adapting the novel and expanding its concepts. He hoped it would allow him to make a film which conformed to the classical Aristotelian unity, a single action on a single location within 24 hours or a single point in time. Tarkovsky viewed the idea of the zone as a dramatic tool to draw out the personalities of the three protagonists, particularly the psychological damage from everything that happens to the idealistic views of the stalker, as he finds himself unable to make others happy. This, too, is what Stalker is about. The hero goes through moments of despair when his faith is shaken, but every time he comes to a renewed sense of his vocation to serve people who have lost their hopes and illusions. The film departs considerably from the novel. According to an interview with Tarkovsky in 1979, the film has basically nothing in common with the novel except for the two words stalker and zone. Yet, several similarities remain between the novel and the film. In both works, the zone is guarded by a police or military guard, apparently authorized to use deadly force. The stalker in both works tests the safety of his path by tossing nuts and bolts tied with scraps of cloth, verifying that gravity is working as usual. A character named Porcupine is a mentor to Stalker. In the novel, frequent visits to the zone increase the likelihood of abnormalities in the visitor's offspring. In the book, the stalker's daughter has light hair all over her body, while in the film she is crippled and has psychokinetic abilities. The meat grinder, a particularly perilous location, is mentioned in both film and the book. Neither in the novel nor in the film do the women enter the zone. Indeed, the film features a female character who is introduced as wishing to enter the zone, but who is dismissed by the stalker prior to departure. Finally, the target of the expedition in both works is a wish-granting device. In Roadside Picnic, the site was specifically described as the site of alien visitation. The name of the novel derives from a metaphor proposed by a character who compares the visit to a roadside picnic. The closing monologue by the stalker's wife at the end of the film has no equivalent in the novel. An early draft of the screenplay was published as a novel titled Stalker, or The Wish Machine, that differs substantially from the finished film. In an interview on the MK2 DVD, the production designer Rashid Safiullin recalled that Tarkovsky spent a year shooting all the outdoor scenes. However, when the crew returned to Moscow, they found that the film had been improperly developed and their footage was unusable. The film had been shot on new Kodak 5247 stock, with which Soviet laboratories were not very familiar, even before the film stock problem was discovered. Relations between Tarkovsky and Stalker's first cinematographer, Andrei Rublev, had deteriorated. After seeing the poorly developed material, Tarkovsky fired him. Safiullin contends that Tarkovsky was so despondent at having to discard all the outdoor work that he wanted to abandon further work on the film. After the loss of the film stock, the Soviet film boards wanted to shut the film down, but Tarkovsky came up with a solution. He asked to be allowed to make a two-part film, which meant additional deadlines and more funds. Tarkovsky ended up reshooting almost all of the film with the new cinematographer, Knyazinski. According to Safiullin, the finished version of Stalker is completely different from the one Tarkovsky originally shot. The film was not released for quite a long time. However, unlike most of Tarkovsky's other films, Stalker was particularly not subject to censorship edits, and had a more or less successful distribution fate in the USSR. The documentary film Rublev and Tarkovsky, The Reverse Side of Stalker, by Igor Mayboroda, offers a different interpretation of the relationship between Rublev and Tarkovsky. Rublev felt that Tarkovsky was not ready for the script. He told Tarkovsky to rewrite the script in order to achieve a good result. Tarkovsky ignored him and continued shooting. After several arguments, he sent him home. Ultimately, Tarkovsky shot Stalker 3 times, consuming over 5,000 meters, or 16,000 feet, of film. People who have seen both the first version shot by Rublev as director of photography and the final theatrical release say that they are almost identical. Tarkovsky sent home other crew members in addition to Rublev, excluding them from the credits as well. Several people involved in the film production, and possibly Tarkovsky himself, died from causes that some crew members attributed to the film's long shooting schedule and toxic locations. Sound designer Vladimir Sharoun recalled, "We were shooting near Tallinn in the area around the small river Yagala with a half-functioning hydroelectric station. Up the river was a chemical plant, and it poured out poisonous liquids downstream. There was even this shot in Stalker. Snow falling in the summer and white foam floating down the river. In fact, it was some horrible poison. Many women in our crew got allergic reactions on their faces. Tarkovsky died of cancer of the right bronchial tube, and Toya Solonitsyn too. That it was all connected to the location shooting for Stalker became clear to me when Larissa Tarkovskaya died from the same illness in Paris." In their first reviews, Western critics in the early 1980s viewed the film through the prism of the political and historical context of life in the USSR at that time. Another view was an attempt to attribute the film to the so-called ecological theme, which anticipated the history of Chernobyl. Later analysis revealed the multidimensional and deep philosophical context of the film. In Stalker, Tarkovsky deviates from the symbolism that permeates his previous films, the motif of flight, images of childhood, figures of mother and father, animals, especially horses, the beloved rain. At the final stage of his creative path, Tarkovsky comes to minimalism. The film is more compressed and holistic, turning the viewer to the traditions of pure cinema. The aesthetic sequence of the plot, the direct perspective of the key frames, the color scheme using monochrome, everything is subordinated to one goal. The continuity of the action, unhurried, paradoxically endless, is emphasized by Stalker's words that in the zone, the direct path is not the shortest. The music of Edward Artemiev, emphasizing the detached and otherworldly motive of the plot, became an important component of the essential action on the screen. The music of Edward Artemiev, emphasizing the detached and otherworldly motive of the plot, became an important component of the existential action on the screen. The world of Stalker in its ordinariness, poverty, and achievement is brought to such a degree of unity and intensity that it almost ceases to be an external world and appears as a landscape of the soul after confession. It even seems that the complex of constant themes and pictorial motives that overwhelmed the director for many years, realized by him to the end, exhausted and given to the screen, has been subtracted from Stalker. Due to this, Stalker looks much more complete, more compressed and unified than The Mirror did. This was said by Maya Turovskaya. The first versions of the script had a nuclear explosion, a time loop, and a golden ball instead of a room. After working on the script for a long time, Tarkovsky consistently eliminated any science fiction elements from Roadside Picnic. The hero's journey through the zone changes from an adventure into a philosophical debate that turns into apocalyptic despair. The entire meaning of the film lies in the movement from the ordinary world to the metaphorical world of the zone, from the real to the ideal, and ultimately to the goal of the journey, the room, and the fulfillment of desires. The identification of the path that the heroes take in the search for oneself is one of the main philosophical messages of the film. The very beginning of the film, the journey on a handcar, is filmed as a journey into another, surreal world. In the zone, all familiar landmarks collapse. What is dangerous in ordinary life is here, a meaningless pile of scrap metal. The menacing traps of the zone in the film are not so much physical traps as spiritual and psychological ones. Researchers of Tarkovsky's work distinguish a unique trilogy: Solaris, The Mirror, and Stalker. It is all about the search for oneself in the inner path. In one way or another, the heroes in them come into contact with the possibility of fulfilling secret desires. All these films explore the conflict between rationalism and science on the one hand and faith on the other. The image of Sartorius from Solaris is very close to the professor from Stalker, who seeks a rational explanation for the phenomena that he is forced to observe. Christian symbolism and spiritual motives, which Tarkovsky repeatedly resorted to, are also clearly evident in the plot of Stalker. In the scene that takes place after the heroes overcome the waterfall, film scholars Johnson and Petrie saw a clear reference to the Gospel of Luke, the events in Emmaus, where two apostles did not recognize Jesus when they met him. The heroes or the voiceover repeatedly quote biblical texts. In the scene of a long flight of the camera over stagnant water, the viewer can see a fragment of Van Eyck's Ghent altarpiece. However, Tarkovsky himself did not believe that the Christian theme and Christian origins were so important in the film. From his point of view, much more significant was the clash of the rational and the irrational, the material and the spiritual, which is clearly manifested in the conflict between Stalker and his two companions. The plot of the film mainly concentrates on three heroes, their arguments and actions. Each of their image carries its own philosophical origin: the professor, scientific materialism; the writer, the artist's worldview, degenerated into cynicism; the Stalker himself is faith. The faith of the three main heroes is subjected to a severe test, and they, stopping at this threshold of the room, do not withstand it. The Stalker returns from the zone to his wife, and sick daughter disappointed in people. The acting in the film is not so noticeable and fades into the background. The viewer is much more attracted by the visual component. In the film, Tarkovsky cast his favorite actors Grinko and Solzhenitsyn, but critics separately noted a new face, Alexander Kadinovsky, who looks so convincing in the role of the holy fool, Stalker. Assistant director Yevgeny Simbal recalled that almost all the actors had to find a completely unnatural approach to the embodiment of the role, force themselves to become different. This was especially true for Kadinovsky, who in life saw himself as a complete opposite of the image of Stalker, a consistent, integral, and tough person. As for the idea of Stalker, it cannot be formulated verbally. I am telling you personally, this is the tragedy of a man who wants to believe, who wants to make himself and others believe in something. For this, he goes to the zone. Do you understand? In a completely pragmatic world, he wants to make someone believe in something, but he does not succeed. No one needs him. In this place, the zone, is also not needed by anyone. That is, the film is about the victory of materialism, Tarkovsky says. And in another interview, he described the main idea of the film as follows. It is important for me to establish in this film that specifically human, insoluble, indecomposable thing that crystallizes in the soul of each person and constitutes their value. After all, despite the fact that outwardly the heroes seem to suffer a fiasco, in fact, each of them gains something invaluably more important. Faith, a sense of the most important thing in themselves. This is the most important thing that lives in each person. Candidate of psychological sciences Natalia Fedorova saw in the story and film the development of the traditional theme of wandering in Russian culture. In the image of Kadinovsky's hero, she saw a new stage in the development of this phenomenon as an attempt at physical survival in overcoming the extreme conditions of a hypothetical future, as well as the resolution of an internal crisis associated with an individual worldview. Stalker became an important milestone in Tarkovsky's creative path and significantly influenced the people with whom he worked together, the cinematic language, and laid down unique traditions. On the set of Stalker, future directors Yevgeny Simbal and Konstantin Lopushansky studied alongside Tarkovsky. The role of Stalker radically changed the life and creative destiny of Kadinovsky. After filming with Tarkovsky, he enrolled in courses for directors, but they are unable to work again in the future. The film, The Bodyguard, was shot as an obvious imitation of the theme of Stalker, and in many ways by the same team, but the idea was not fully realized. In 1981 to 1982, Arkady Strugatsky and Tarkovsky met several times and together wrote the script for the film Beware, Snakes, and hatched plans for a film adaptation of The Beetle in the Anthill. According to the biographer of the Strugatsky brothers, Ants Galandis, the script for Tarkovsky's last film, The Sacrifice, is largely a joint work of Tarkovsky and Arkady Strugatsky. The Stalker film score is composed by Edward Artemiev, who had also composed the scores for Tarkovsky's previous films, Solaris and The Mirror. For Stalker, Artemiev composed and recorded two different versions of the score. The first score was done with an orchestra alone, but was rejected by Tarkovsky. The second score that was used in the final film was created on the synthesizer along with traditional instruments that were manipulated using sound effects. In the final film score, the boundaries between music and sound were blurred, as natural sounds and music interact to the point where they are indistinguishable. In fact, many of the natural sounds were not production sounds, but were created by Artemiev on his synthesizer. For Tarkovsky, music was more than just a parallel illustration of the visual image. He believed that music distorts and changes the emotional tone of a visual image, while not changing the meaning. He also believed that in a film with complete theoretical consistency, music will have no place, and that instead, music is replaced by sounds. According to Tarkovsky, he aimed at this consistency and moved into this direction in Stalker and Nostalgia. In addition to the original monophonic soundtrack, the Russian Cinema Council, Rossiko, created an alternative 5.1 surround soundtrack for the 2001 DVD release. In addition to remixing the mono soundtrack, music and sound effects were removed and added in several scenes. Music was added to the scene where the three are traveling to the zone, on the rail. In the opening and the final scene, Beethoven's Ninth Symphony was removed, and in the opening scene in Stalker's house, ambient sounds were added, changing the original soundtrack, in which this scene was completely silent except for the sounds of a train. Initially, Tarkovsky had no clear understanding of the musical atmosphere of the final film, and only an approximate idea where, in the film, the music was to be. Even after he had shot all the material, he continued his search for the ideal film score, wanting a combination of Oriental and Western music. In a conversation with Artemiev, he explained that he needed music that reflects the idea that although the East and the West can coexist, they are not able to understand each other. One of Tarkovsky's ideas was to perform Western music on Oriental instruments, or vice versa. Artemiev proposed to try this idea with the motet Polterima Rosa by an anonymous 14th century Italian composer dedicated to the Virgin Mary. In its original form, Tarkovsky did not perceive the motet as suitable for the film and asked Artemiev to give it an Oriental sound. Later, Tarkovsky proposed to invite musicians from Armenia and Azerbaijan and to let them improvise on the melody of the motet. A musician was invited from Azerbaijan who played the main melody on a tar based on Mugam, accompanied by orchestral background music written by Artemiev. Tarkovsky, who, unusually for him, attended the full recording session, rejected the final result, as this was not what he was looking for. Rethinking their approach, they finally found the solution in a theme that would create a state of inner calmness and inner satisfaction, or as Tarkovsky said, space frozen in a dynamic equilibrium. Artemiev knew about a musical piece from Indian classical music, where a prolonged and unchanged background tone is performed on a tanpura. As this gave Artemiev the impression of frozen space, he used this inspiration and created a background tone on a synthesizer, similar to the background tone performed on the tanpura. The tar then improvised on the background sound, together with the flute as a European, Western instrument. To mask the obvious combination of European and Oriental instruments, he passed the foreground music through the effect channels of his Synthi 100 synthesizer. These effects included modulating the sound of the flute and lowering the speed of the tar, so that what Artemiev called the life of one string could be heard. Tarkovsky was amazed by the result, especially liking the sound of the tar, and used the theme without any alterations in the film. The title sequence is accompanied by Artemiev's main theme. The opening sequence of the film showing Stalker's room is mostly silent. Periodically one hears what could be a train. The sound becomes louder and clearer over the time, until the sound and vibrations of objects in the room give a sense of a train passing by, without the train being visible. This oral impression is quickly subverted by the muffled sound of Beethoven's Symphony No. 9. The source of this music is unclear, thus setting the tone for the blurring of reality in the film. For this part of the film, Tarkovsky was also considering music by Richard Wagner, or the Marseillaise. In an interview with Tonino Guerrera in 1979, Tarkovsky said that he wanted music that is more or less popular, that expresses the movement of the masses, the theme of humanity's social destiny, but this music must be barely heard beneath the noise, in a way that the spectator is not aware of it. I would like most of the noise and sound to be composed by a composer. In the film, for example, the three people undertake a long journey in a railway car. I'd like that the noise of the wheels on the rails not be the natural sound, but elaborated upon by the composer with electronic music. At the same time, one mustn't be aware of music nor natural sounds. The journey into the zone on a motorized rail car features a disconnection between the visual image and the sound. The presence of the rail car is registered only through the clanking sound of the wheels on the tracks. Neither the rail car nor the scenery passing by is shown, since the camera is focused on the faces of the characters. This disconnection draws the audience into the inner world of the characters and transforms the physical journey into an inner journey. This effect on the audience is reinforced by Artemiev's synthesizer effects, which make the clanking wheel sound less and less natural as the journey progresses. When the three arrive in the zone initially, it appears to be silent. Only after some time, and only slightly audibly, can one hear the sound of a distant river, the sound of the blowing wind, or the occasional cry of an animal. These sounds grow richer and more audible, while the stalker makes his first venture into the zone, as if the sound draws him toward the zone. The sparseness of sounds in the zone draws attention to specific sounds, which, as in other scenes, are largely disconnected from the visual image. Animals can be heard in the distance, but are never shown. A breeze can be heard, but no visual reference is shown. This effect is reinforced by occasional synthesizer effects, which meld with the natural sounds and blur the boundaries between artificial and alien sounds and the sounds of nature. During the journey in the zone, the sound of water becomes more and more prominent, which, combined with a visual image, presents the zone as a drenched world. In an interview, Tarkovsky dismissed the idea that water has a symbolic meaning in his films, saying, "There is so much rain in his films because it is always raining in Russia." In another interview on the film Nostalgia, however, he said, "Water is a mysterious element, a single molecule of which is very photogenic. It can convey movement and a sense of change and flux." Emerging from the tunnel called the Micronder by the Stalker, the three arrive at the entrance of their destination, the room. Here, as in the rest of the film, sound is constantly changing and not necessarily connected to the visual image. The journey in the zone ends with the three sitting in the room, silent, with no audible sound. When the sound resumes, it is again the sound of water, but with a different timbre, softer and gentler, as if to give a sense of catharsis and hope. The transition back to the world outside the zone is supported by sound. While the camera still shows a pool of water inside the zone, the audience begins to hear the sound of a train in Ravel's Bolero, reminiscent of the opening scene. The soundscape of the world outside the zone is the same as before, characterized by train wheels, foghorns of a ship, and train whistles. The film ends as it began, with the sound of a train passing by, accompanied by the muffled sound of Beethoven's Symphony No. 9. This time, the ode to joy from the final moments of the symphony. As in the rest of the film, the disconnect between the visual image and the sound leaves the audience unclear whether the sound is real or an illusion. Stalker sold 4.3 million tickets in the Soviet Union. Upon its release, the film's reception was less than favorable. Officials at Ghost Kino were critical of the film. On being told that Stalker should be faster and more dynamic, Tarkovsky replied, "The film needs to be slower and duller at the start, so that the viewers who walked into the wrong theater have time to leave before the main action starts." The Ghost Kino representative then stated that he was trying to give the point of view of the audience. Tarkovsky supposedly retorted, "I am only interested in the views of two people. One is called Bresson, and one Bergman." More recently, reviews of the film have been highly positive. On review aggregator Rotten Tomatoes, Stalker is rated at 100% based on 43 reviews, with an average rating of 8.6 out of 10. Its critical consensus states, "Stalker is a complex, oblique parable that draws unforgettable images and philosophical musings from its sci-fi thriller setting." Metacritic assigned the film a weighted average score of 85 out of 100, based on 17 critics, indicating universal acclaim. It earned a place in the British Film Institute's 100 Greatest Films of All Time poll conducted for Sight and Sound in September 2012. The group's critics listed Stalker at joint number 29. Directors ranked it at 30. In The Guardian, Geoff Dyer described the film as synonymous both with cinema's claims to high art and a test of the viewer's ability to appreciate it as such. Critic Derek Adams of the Time Out Film Guide has compared Stalker to Francis Ford Coppola's Apocalypse Now, also released in 1979, and argued that as a journey to the heart of darkness, Stalker looks a good deal more persuasive than Coppola's. Slant magazine reviewer Nick Shager has praised the film as an endlessly pliable allegory about human consciousness. In 2018, the film was voted the 49th greatest non-English language film of all time in a poll by BBC Culture involving 209 critics in 43 countries. The film heavily influenced the Cacophony Society, which began in 1986 in the San Francisco Bay Area and which organized zone trips for participants. The first burning of a wooden symbolic man at Black Rock Desert, Nevada occurred on Zone Trip No. 4 in 1990. This occasion evolved into an enormous annual festival of arts, music, and culture called Burning Man. In a roundabout way, Soviet cinema is responsible for Burning Man. How about that? Stalker was the inspiration for the 1995 album of the same title by Robert Rich and B. Lustmord, which has been noted for its eerie soundscapes and dark ambience. A novel written by Jessica Schneider puts it well. In watching Andrei Tarkovsky's 1979 film Stalker, I found myself missing a man I'd ever met, who died when I was only 10. He is one of those directors who, amid the visual, transcends film as a medium and moves it into something other, something ethereal, and something understandable. Yet, as for what that understanding is, it will vary upon audience. I also recently reviewed Antonini's Red Desert, wherein I refer to the human intrusion that has desecrated nature. By contrast, Stalker is almost a rebellion to all of that, nature's uprise perhaps. After all, where do humans fit amid all this? Where exactly are we supposed to fall? The story, shot in long, dreamlike sequences, is meant to immerse one into a sort of dream. I often thought that watching a Tarkovsky film is the closest to observing dream. The film, set in an unknown country in an unknown time, begins with a journey involving unnamed citizens. Stalker, writer, and professor are the titles distinguishing these three figures who, in their search through the zone, a site supposedly loaded with traps, contains a room where one can wish for their secret desires to come true. The anonymity of these characters serves a purpose, that this could be any of us. And what of the zone? How do we interpret this place that is ever so difficult to navigate? Here, weeds are overgrown, according to human standards anyway, and the flowers hold no scent. When the writer is asked what he writes about, "My readers," he replies. Within the zone, these humans are helpless, forced below the brunt of nature. In one particular scene, the stalker lowers himself into the overgrown green. Seemingly, he drops into the earth and rolls within the vegetation, only to then look up and engage in conversation with the professor. A small insect delicately traverses his finger. "You've brought many people here," the professor says. "Not as many as I would like," the stalker replies. When asked if he would ever use the room for himself, the stalker insists that he is fine as is. Then, in a moment of memory or imagined flashback, we see him, in sepia coloring, in a fetal position within a canal. A black dog approaches, whom we witness a number of times. In one of the most haunting scenes, the dog sits alone on a slab of concrete. Amid the untamed vegetation, the dog then stands without any hint of command. It clearly is tamer than the weeds that surround. The stalker warns that the zone is filled with traps. He and his two companions attempt to detonate any potential dangers by tossing small cloths tied to metal rings. For much of the zone, the land is damp and murky, whilst chemical-filled waters grow impassable, too difficult to navigate. Much like the artist who is forced to navigate a world of social climbers, attention seekers, and corporate parasites, he will inevitably feel that he does not belong. A man writes because he is tormented, because he doubts, the stalker says. He needs to constantly prove himself that he is worth something. Tarkovsky once said that he believed the Book of Revelation to be the most beautiful piece of writing ever written. Then, in a slow child's whisper, we hear the biblical words accompanying a long flow of imagery. We could either be above or below the waterline. Are those trees reflected from above, or are we witnessing them from below? Mechanical debris lingers from a bygone time. Within the zone, nature is indifferent, and it contains its own form of beautiful. Much like looking at images following the 1986 Chernobyl disaster, amid the chemical disease, apples still grow from trees. This is the world without human intrusion. I sometimes wonder if humans are only as worthy as memory. As noted in Tarkovsky's 1975 film, The Mirror, it is not what one remembers, but how one remembers that matters. The men discuss a previous stalker named Porcupine, who led his brother to the zone, which resulted in his brother's death. Then, upon arriving at the room, he was bestowed with a large sum of money, his secret wish. Rather than bringing his brother back, guilt-ridden, this resulted in his suicide. An argument among the three men ensues, wherein the notion that the room can be used for evil is addressed, and does anyone know his secret desires? Weakness is a great thing, and strength is nothing, the stalker mentions. When a man is just born, he is weak and flexible. When he dies, he is hard and insensitive.
Пусть они победят. Пусть не смеются своими страстями. Ведь то, что они называют страстью, на самом деле не душевная энергия, а лишь трение между душой и внешним миром. А главное, понять себя. Но беспомощными, как дети. Потому что слабость велика, а сила ничтожна. Когда человек родится, он слаб и гибок. Когда умирает, он крепок и черств. Когда дерево растет, оно нежно и гибко. А когда оно сухо и жестко, оно умирает. Черствость и сила – спутники смерти. Гибкость и слабость выражают свежесть бытия. Поэтому, что отвердело, то не победит.
When a tree is growing, it's tender and pliant, but when it's dry and hard, it dies. Hardness and strength are death's companions. Or in other words, to think one knows all the answers, that he is indestructible, is to become ossified both in body and mind. The three men come to realize that there is no happiness to be found here, and hence, they abandon the mission. Yet one must ask, were they really in search of it? It was Tarkovsky himself who said that the world wasn't created for man's happiness, but rather, we are here to fight so that good and evil can clash within us. I have often believed that my best work was created whilst I was most unhappy, and that it is this unhappiness that causes my conflict within. After all, without conflict there is no drama, and without drama, there is no narrative. Perhaps the success of creation is enough of a reward itself, but I, much like the characters within Stalker, will still long for this happiness nonetheless. Stalker is not sad, but it is melancholic. It is not idyllic. We witness these characters in their suffering, including the Stalker's wife who drops to the floor in a mess of tears upon his departure, as well as their longing. We witness the Stalker's telekinetic daughter. What results from their journey into the deeps of the zone? The unobservant would say nothing, but I argue they come to realize that one's desire, one's happiness, cannot be obtained simply by wish. The result would be too nebulous. In one scene, the writer lifts himself from a puddle and sits on a large open metal rim. He drops in a stone that takes time before sound hits. It reverberates. There is no such thing as facts, he says. Facts, after all, make one's mind rigid, hard. They can obstruct creativity. Instead, for the artist, one's mind must bend and be fluid. There is no single answer. This is where the article ends. Writer, in my opinion, came the closest to understanding, as in the scene with Monkey and the table. He went the furthest, aside from Stalker. And yet still came too short. Popular opinions are as follow. The ending is a question about faith posed to the audience. There are two ways to interpret the scene. She literally moved the glass with her mind. A passing train in the background is shaking the building, and that is what is moving the glass. It is also possibly implying she's deaf. The question then becomes, which is it? To choose scenario 1, to choose faith, and to believe that there is magic in the world. That it can live on in us as a part of our true nature. To choose scenario 2 is to reject faith, and to embrace the world as a miserable place, full of meaningless poverty, and the industrial rape of the natural world. The question of faith posed to the audience even has a crafty setup in the preceding scene. The shot opens on the daughter moving forward, but without seeing the lower half of her body, the film practically dares the audience to jump to the conclusion that the Stalker's true wish was for a miracle to heal his daughter's leg affliction, and the room is granted it. Then we see she was just riding on her dad's shoulders nonchalantly. At the end of the film, we see Monkey, whom is outside of the zone, presented in full color. This creates a visual connection between her and the zone. We are told that stalkers will always have deformed children. What if the stalker's biggest desire was to have a child without a deformation? A child that is strong enough to have the ability to move? What if he entered the room and Monkey's telekinetic power was the manifestation of his desire? A desire that manifested in Monkey not being able to move herself, but being mentally strong enough to move other objects with her mind. What is all this art trying to communicate? At times, one might wonder whether Stalker is reliable and whether the dangers of the zone are real, or whether the room is just a superstitious fallacy. Skeptics might want to view the film rationally and scientifically, and explain the way the zone is the site of a nuclear accident like Chernobyl. Taken as a whole, especially in light of Tarkovsky's own rejection of a purely materialistic view of life, this poster is convinced the film wants us to accept that the threats in the zone are real, along with the room and the reward it promises to all who are prepared to complete the religious quest needed to reach it. This interpretation is supported by the fact that we see a wind arise when the professor tries taking a shortcut, and also the impact that the zone has had on Stalker's daughter and her apparently telekinetic powers. It's also supported by what happened with Porcupine, a previous Stalker who committed suicide after obtaining his inner desires. Additional evidence in favor of this interpretation is the main premise of Roadside Picnic, the novel that the movie is based on. Reading a synopsis of the book's plot can be helpful to discard wrong interpretation of the film that were clearly not intended. So, even if there are parts of the film hard to explain, it seems clear that the character of Stalker needs to be accepted as a trustworthy character, and that what he says about the zone is true, even if Stalker's own journey of faith has flaws and imperfections. But what makes Tarkovsky's contribution to cinema all the more important for him personally are the religious themes that he works with. He has the same Russian Orthodox Church background as literary greats like Dostoevsky, so it should come as no surprise that it employs similar themes. Like Dostoevsky, Tarkovsky rejected the idea of a materialistic, disbelieving world, so it seems plausible to interpret the film with Stalker representing the holy fool that is a common motif in Russian literature. His role typifies the importance of following a spiritual guide, rather than following our own path, and the importance of viewing life through the eyes of faith. Navigating the zone is like a religious quest or trial that requires believing and following a guide. For me as a Christian, this suggests something about the essence of faith, where we are led by God's word and follow what he says. The writer and the professor are never named, and are presented as two intellectuals, possibly representing arts and science respectively. The professor is a skeptic and unbeliever, while the writer is an agnostic, and both struggle to accept the apparent powers and dangers of the zone. In the end, both end up following Stalker, who is a man of faith, but this is only after their own personal failures to accomplish what they came to do in the zone. This also explains the closing scenes, where Stalker laments humanity's loss of the faith needed for going through the zone, and for living the good life. In a world of increasing secularism, materialism, rationalism, and scientific thought, Tarkovsky wants us to hold on to the importance of faith and religious thinking. Another important theme is about human desire. While the room holds the promise of tremendous power, it is also very dangerous. An account of a previous Stalker named Porcupine is offered as a cautionary tale in this regard. He took his brother into the zone, but sacrificed him at the meat grinder in order to enter the room himself. Porcupine later won the lottery and became very rich, but subsequently hanged himself. His stated desire might have been to restore his brother back to life, but what if his greatest secret desire was actually different from what he thought, and it was just a materialistic craving for money? Realizing this afterwards made Porcupine realize he wasn't a very good man, and brought him to suicide, perhaps in part to expiate himself for his guilt. What are we to make of the lengthy dream sequence, where we get a series of images of debris and flotsam and water, fish, a religious icon, money, a rusted gun, a lock, barbed wire, a spring, a human hand? And what is the significance of the dog that roams freely in the zone and follows the trio back out? At times the imagery is deeply religious, such as a moment when the writer has a crown of thorns on his head. But what does it all mean? Without an interpreter, I find myself baffled, but also intrigued and deeply curious. It's certainly a demanding film, and the fact that it is somewhat inaccessible, and that its meaning is somewhat hidden, is also somewhat frustrating. At the same time, we should be careful not to allegorize the film too quickly, and want to interpret all its details as symbols. Tarkovsky himself shied away from the concept of symbols and preferred to speak about metaphors. In interviews, he said that while a symbol contains within itself definite meaning, a metaphor is an image and is indefinite in meaning and cannot be fully deciphered. He wanted his films to be works of art, but not in the sense that everything can be explained, because he believed that there are aspects of his films that are abstractions, that transmit truth which can only be comprehended in one's own heart. If we're going to take his vision for his films seriously, we must be cautious to not analyze everything, but also allow the images to touch our soul. In other words, accept it for what it is. Don't overthink it. Allow it to wash over you, become part of you. That isn't to say you should disregard the image, the film, the message, One doesn't cancel out the other. As Tarkovsky says, the East and West may coexist. Here, they both may remain. Tarkovsky continues in the metaphorical symbol vein. He doesn't want his films to be interpreted as allegories. Another quote, "I never create allegories, I create my own world." The world does not signify anything unusual, it just exists. It has no other meaning. I think symbol and allegory rob the artist. Creator brings up images which express, reveal life the way it is. They are not Aesop's fables. This manner of working would be true primitive not only for the contemporary art, but for art of any era. Artistic image possesses an infinity of meanings just like life carries an infinity of meanings. An image changed into a symbol cannot be analyzed. When I create my images, I use no symbolism of any kind. I want to create an image, not a symbol. That's why I don't believe in interpretations of supposed meanings of my pictures. I'm not interested in narrow political or social issues. I want to create images that would touch the viewer's soul to some degree. That's why in my films, I tell precisely those stories, and not the others. Some say that The Mirror is his best, his most approachable film, and others say they struggle with Solaris. I didn't mind Solaris, and I certainly didn't expect the station to have visitors, one such being your dead wife. In the autobiographical documentary Voyage in Time from 1983, Tarkovsky says he viewed Solaris as an artistic failure, because his film did not transcend genre, as he believed his film Stalker did. Due to the required technological dialogue and special effects. On 4chan's TV board, the top 100 films of all time, Stalker was number 3, underneath 2001, and above Blade Runner. Some questions. What is up with the Revelations quote other than containing vivid imagery? Directly following the stalker's dream and wife's narration, he wakes up and says something about the same day again. Maybe this is hinting that the zone is making him repeat some past trauma we only get glimpses of. Is the dog just a dog? Why does it leave the zone with him? Its behavior seems unnatural. Should we believe that the metal door opening and closing confirms that the zone not only rearranges space, but also time? I'm not sure who other than the stalker would be opening and closing a door like that, and we do see him doing it earlier in the film. And this is the main thing that confuses me. The poster. Where does the blood come from that we see in the last shot of the zone? The professor seemingly throws the last piece of the disabled bomb into the water inside the room. And then slowly, the screen is filled with blood. What is this supposed to imply, considering that all 3 of them make it outside of the zone? A reply says, I see the dog as being within the rhythm of the zone, and I see it as drawn to the stalker who is most attuned to the zone. I think there is also a contrast between the way an animal behaves in general, and then its goal is to survive, and through it, that it inuits how to navigate its environments. A dog does not have complex desires. Man does, and that is why man came to the zone. Perhaps this is why the dog is shown to just casually trot wherever it seems to please, in contrast to the stalker and pals, who navigate in a ritualistic, terrified manner. The zone does not challenge the animal in the same manner, because it can't by nature defile it to the extent man can through complex, volatile desires. Additionally, the way the dog behaves is similar to how the dogs behave in nostalgia. They seem extremely calm and well-trained in contrast to their volatile owners, or humans. They are unreadable and seem to exist persistently between dreams, memories, and the present reality. This dynamic is more present in nostalgia, but the stalker dog does it too. Another reply answers his other questions, or tries. Revelations. I took this to be suggestive of a severe impending transformation of the world, severe enough for their characters, Stalker's wife especially, perceive it as its death. His points about the dog are very good. Dogs are also a classic symbol of death by way of Cerberus. I didn't take this as a rearrangement of time, meaning the door, although that's interesting, but as a limited form of agency, where the zone itself can take some physical actions. If I recall correctly, the blood was remnant of others who had previously died in the zone. The flooding is due to some kind of perturbations of physical law within the room, and again an omen of destructive change to come in the world. Some trivia. Yes, the fox was planned. According to the original plan, there should have been a fox in place of the dog, most likely under the influence of Chinese mythology, where she usually turns out to be an evil force. According to Tarkovsky, she had to walk around the frame where we need to. But foxes in Estonia, where the episode was filmed, are rare, so they are not amenable to training. The fox was replaced with a dog. Number 2. Anubis. Then the question arose about the breed of the dog. not a Dachshund and not a black poodle as in Faust. The director went over it. As a result, he settled on the braid of the Egyptian Anubis statuette from the Pushkin Museum and showed the assistant the shape of his head with large ears on his fingers. The assistant in charge of the props found such a dog, but it belonged to a disabled woman. The smart dog knew how to go to the store by himself, press the doorbell button with his nose, etc. No one dared to ask this woman for such an assistant even for a while. The language barrier. The right animal was found by an Estonian girl who worked at the zoo. His name was Reni Raimo, and he understood commands only in Estonian, which none of the crew knew. They had to be written down on a piece of paper and read out whenever it was necessary. Listed in the credits. Reni Raimo seemed to Tarkovsky to be such an important performer that she was listed in the credits along with other artists of the episodes. I'm not going to reiterate what we all just heard multiple times for recollection. I agree with the majority of what was said. Tarkovsky is unmatched, a spiritual visionary in tune, like no other. He even kept his actors for years and years. Isn't that nice? The lead actress in Solaris wanted to stop on his deathbed in France, but wasn't able. To put it the best way, Tarkovsky takes a menial trip and transforms it into something much greater, more philosophical. If we miss the slightest detail, that's okay. But it's important to note that things are, can, and have been missed, so there was a trained eye for this. This film was made twice, killed the majority of the crew and cast, ironically a sacrifice, for art. I dug up some more, trying to find everything I possibly could. I found a website that you could book for it, maybe showings. I discovered that Edward Artemiev died recently, but did an interview shortly before his death. As Artemiev says, Tarkovsky surprised him. He said that he didn't need music in his film and needed someone to orchestrate sounds of nature, asking him on for Solaris. He needed a composer's ear and hand to organize the sounds surrounding us according to the laws of music. I watched the footage where he filmed nature, he said. I didn't yet know what to do, but I was gradually getting an idea. At some point I told him, you can't do it without any music at all. If you want to use only background noise, then it will be dead. You need to somehow liven it up. And then it occurred to me that we could use orchestral sounds, voices, tapping of the strings light as the rustle of grass, very subtle. He liked that very much. And that's how we slowly created a musical language. Only in the hands of a genius like Tarkovsky can the simple narrative structure of three men on a journey be transformed to a complicated moral and spiritual examination of humanity, anchored to references of classical poetry, literature, music, and art.